just want to get started. So we have Mary here, Leslie, Mary's English, Child Development Center, ECE as well. Scott Lukas, I teach sociology and anthropology, and my new role is called faculty chair of teaching and learning, involved heavily with the Promise program and some other areas. I don't know who's on YouTube, but welcome to you, and I'll try to check the live feed so we can get your question in maybe later. And we may have some people coming in. If you are watching online, if you got the calendar invite, I sent out some backup materials for this particular conversation. And this one I had structured. I was talking actually with J.D. Dirk, who teaches in political science and history, and we were just discussing like empathy in the classroom and to what degree we use empathy with our students. It could also apply to our coworkers. Hey, welcome. There's Wynn Walker just stepped in mathematics. There's a handout here if you'd like.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hi,
so,
how are you?
We made it, Chris.
Yeah, so on this handout at the top, the basic definition of empathy, which is also here, an ability to understand and share the feelings of another person, and that could be applied in so many different contexts you could think of. Obviously not just teaching, but conversations. I was in an ISP meeting today with our Incarcerated Student Program Steering Committee, and we often talk about our ability to empathize with students who aren't just students, but also are incarcerated. So it's a skill, I think, or a value, if you will, that we use a lot probably in our practice. If you're a director running a facility, you have to think about all the people you serve in the community. You have to think about teachers, co-workers, and so forth. So to try to balance this out, I gave you two pieces. The first one is called Habits of Empathy, written by someone at Mission College, and it was talking about 6 values of empathy that could be great with our students. And I listed those up here. So those are the positive values, the sense of having students be curious about the world, that sense of wanting to learn, very relevant with multiculturalism, teaching about diversity. We always talk about in cultural anthropology, for example, the goal of what's called cultural relativism, where you try to get someone to relate to another way of thinking, another way of living. And then general cultural diversity, or what we call today intercultural communication, where we try to bridge the gaps between different communities, people of different thought patterns, different cultures, different ethnicities. So there's like the positives. The negatives of empathy, really that's kind of item 3, which is this article, Does Empathy Have a Dark Side? And this was an NPR story and also a book by Fritz Breithaupt, which is called The Dark Sides of Empathy. And I try to list on here just some of the things that the author of this particular piece points out in the interview about some negative things about empathy. So what happens if someone becomes so connected to understanding and sharing the feelings of another that they join what we call in sociology a high-demand religious movement or a cult, or terrorism is an example of over-identifying with someone who has a particular belief pattern. And then what was interesting about the article, they also talk about the idea that empathy could be more about, like the example of the helicopter parent, where you're like, I really want to help you out, I want to do something for you, but in reality, it may be coming more from your desire to control the kid or control someone. And I was thinking about this recently with classroom situations where, particularly with the Promise program, and if you're new to the Promise program, we launched it just this year, and it's about adding structure and a little more prescription for students. So we don't allow students anymore to just take any class they want. We try to define the classes they take. They enroll in a class which I'm teaching 3 sections of this quarter, which is basically an LTCC 101 class. It's study skills. Today we're working on financial literacy. So we're, in a sense, defining for them a little more closely and prescriptively their worldview as a student. And I was having a conversation with some colleagues about this and saying, to what degree do we empathize with students and their challenges, their lives, their work schedules, their being single parents, they're dealing with disabilities, all these issues. To what extent do we do that? How much do we do that versus this sort of being prescriptive and saying, we really need you to be more proactive with your own education. We need you to be on top of things. We need you to come to class. We need you to do well in your math class or your English classes and so forth. So for me, empathy almost comes in at this level in my new position where we're teaching the Promise students some things about self-mastery and about being responsible and proactive. But how much do we draw a line there when we're in a class and a student says to us, I didn't get my paper in my English class because of this. You know, do we empathize with that student? Because we were all students, for some of us, for me, many years ago, like in the late Pleistocene, you know. But we were all there. We understand it. Because, you know, we worked in college, we struggled and so forth. We've all been there. But I think when working with students today, I think for me, some of the dynamics have changed. So I wanted to just use this as I guess it's a specific topic, but it could also be really broad to start a conversation about empathy and to what degree you think it relates to your position at the college, teaching, non-teaching, whatever that is. Does that make sense as a starting point, maybe, in the conversation?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel that, you know, empathy is a key part of my job teaching because I teach math. And math, you know, having a right or wrong answer just is extremely anxiety inducing, you know. And I remember, you know, when I was going to school, like certain subjects that came more difficult to me and how much anxiety that caused me as a student.
Right.
So I really try to, you know, put myself, you know, in the student's shoes as much as possible, you know, when it comes to anxiety. It doesn't mean, obviously, everyone gets an A, but, you know, keep that in mind when designing tests. You know, for example, you know, give them, you know, really as much time as they need, you know, within reason, obviously, but, you know, time should not, I feel that time should not be a factor, for example, you know, because that will mitigate the, like, okay, I have as much time to think about this as I want, I don't need to rush through my thought processes.
Is that true for your face-to-face classes as well as ISP? Time limits, or?
Yeah, actually, I do it in my face-to-face classes. ISP, unfortunately, you know, there's a limit for how long they can take exams that's dictated by the facility because they have to duck at the students and everything. But yeah, for my face-to-face classes, definitely. And I try to make it clear, you know, try to be very clear what is going to be on the exam, you know. These practice problems I'm giving you are like what you'll expect to see, so that, you know, to minimize the number of shocks.
Anxiety is a really good topic connecting this, right?
Exactly. Math is just riddled with that.
Yeah.
So I feel like really being able to see where my students are, you know, where they're coming from, you know, even to some extent, you know, what are their backgrounds. They say, you know, I miss a class because of migraines. It's like, I told them, I'm like, I'm really sorry. I can only imagine how awful that is, and I count myself blessed that I don't have migraines myself.
Yeah.
You know, and if they're a student that's genuinely making an effort and coming to classes, you know, then, you know, it seems even more real. If it's someone who's skipping out half the time, I mean, you can tell the difference. So that can sort of help guide empathy too, because obviously you can't take it to an extreme.
So it's almost like if you can gauge the student, their level of commitment,
then
the empathy is possible. Whereas if someone's just using it as a, hey Damion, how are you? Come on in. Damion from primarily Wilderness?
Yes.
Wilderness Education. Oh, and by the way, there's a hand up here. So we're just to get you caught up, we're talking about empathy in a classroom setting, and Wynn had a really good example saying, because math is so anxiety-inducing, she tries to really take that into account and doesn't like having, within reason, time limits set on exams. And then I said, well, we were talking, how do you gauge that? She was saying, if a student, if she feels that the student shows commitment to the class, and you can gauge that, then that allows like empathy to come out or to be possible. Or like, I understand, like your example was someone has migraines, I understand where you're coming from, and so I'm trying to work with you. Whereas if someone is just making an excuse, right, that's probably not something that...
And you can tell. You can tell over time based on the students' overall performance, if they showed up to class on time. I give daily attendance quizzes, you know, to try and encourage that as well. That helps me get to know the students and
Yeah,
their
sure.
situations a little better too.
Yeah. Does anyone want to play off that? Because I think it's a really provocative.
Well, I was just going to say the fact of the time piece. All of my research on empathy recently has been about time that we commit to the student or with people in general to understand where they're coming from, what feelings that are being shared, and just mine's all about relationship building, so how we connect with them and just really lead them in that positivity. So it's time together, relationship building, feelings, all of that you could hear the negative connotations of their oppression, of all the things that go wrong, but then to really build them up on how they can improve or what do they need to do. Like, I understand and I can only imagine, and yet this is the goal, and let's lead you there together, and let's let's get you there together. And maybe that means that you're spending more time with them to get them to that spot.
You're working with the student.
Absolutely.
And with their situation, which is a great idea.
Yeah. But you don't get caught up in just letting it stay there. Like, okay, so
you move
we've had
forward.
some setbacks, and now, let's get back on track.
And I guess the relationship part is interesting because there are cases where I can think back to a few students that I've referred to counseling that, I'm not a psychologist, but my impression was they had an addiction issue and they were maybe on a controlled substance in a classroom setting. And so sometimes I think, there's a line there, to draw. And,
Well,
and that's,
my world is all
your world is all about
relationship-based.
relationships, and for me, as I age, like when I first taught here, and I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my early 50s, it's different too, and I sometimes feel a little more like disconnection just because of that age difference with my students, and I'm more used to classes that have a mix of age ranges, whereas with the promise classes, with maybe 2 exceptions out of 100 students, everyone's in that 18 to 20 range. And so sometimes even having a shared experience is hard because it's like, even our digital experiences, like our social media or the media we choose to engage with, right? So that's a challenge too, but I think relationships is probably, like you're saying, where it starts. We each outline what that is. With ISP students, a curious facet that I know Wynn has encountered is where Shane is always saying, we can't, we shouldn't allow for over-familiarity with students.
Definitely.
My wife recently was teaching poetry in some of the correctional institutions down in Carson, and so she had a variety of conversations with the directors there, the warden, because some of the students said, I want, you're teaching memoir, can I get a list of memoir? Can I give you some personal writing? And sometimes you have to almost break that off and define the relationship, so it probably varies from class to class for the subject we're teaching, whether it's in our incarcerated student program or face-to-face or DE. And DE is another one where I feel because of that social media effect, I often have to step in and say, hey, this is not a social media board. You can't talk the way you're talking. You have to show some respect. And I guess that's part of empathy there, is to say, maybe if you're not familiar with this in social media, because of the relationships there, you have to apply a different set of expectations and be more professional. But relationships is really like what we do so well at community college.
Absolutely.
It's part and parcel to our existence, really. So I just love the focus on relationship. And then time, the idea there is, like you're saying, the relationships develop over time, right? And you get to know someone, they get to know you, and there's more of a sense of familiarity.
Yeah, you want them to love the subject that you're teaching. You want them to get it, right?
Yeah.
And we can all look at what teachers we've had that we've had a connection with and which ones we haven't, and that are cut and dry and know it's this way or the highway, and there's no empathy there, right? And there's no connection. And so, I can remember, it's that classic example of what teachers do you remember and what subject do they teach.
Yep. Very good. Someone want to build on that? Is there an example of conversation?
Oh yeah, I think I love all these topics. Going back to the relationships, it's so critical that's what makes the community college so special, and a selling point for us is that we have the small classrooms, that you get that personal time with the students. And just using the balance of time, because there'll be more high maintenance students.
Right.
And just giving them that feedback that your time, you can only give them so much time because you have other people in the group. One of the things I read going just before this online is the radical listening. And I think that's a really key component for the empathy, is just giving your full attention to that person while they're going through their whatever they're going through.
We used to talk about that you would just notice. I noticed that you seemed a little out of sorts, or I noticed that I might want to check in with you about, whatever if it's the anxiety level, right? And I think just building upon that trust that they, we are essentially putting on that mental health counselor hat to kind of check in on them.
So I think that's part of the radical listening, is being able to give them good feedback. That's the tangible thing, that I'm listening to you and I can give you some sort of feedback that I think might help you.
That's the hard part with thinking, and not a psychology background, but I sometimes think, 20 years, 25 years of full-time teaching, like I wish I had more of that, because I think part of the challenge for, like in a therapeutic context with any kind of counseling, is you listen, but then that person, I think it's a relationship, the person has to want to change, right? And that can be a challenge sometimes, where I feel like if someone has bad study habits, or if they're approaching math or English in totally the wrong way, again, you might have that relationship established, there's rapport, we call it anthropology, both feel good being around each other, but then are they willing to take your feedback? And that's a tricky thing. Elizabeth, our director of program coordinator.
I want to talk about some different understandings of empathy. If you read Brene Brown, does anyone read?
Yeah.
I like her a lot. She talks about empathy and how actually it's not listening with the intent to give any feedback or to fix anything. If you're practicing empathy, then you're with the person in the experience. And you're just like, okay, I understand that you're very upset right now. I feel for you. That's pretty much it. When you start taking on the dynamic that you're providing feedback or fixing solutions, advice, that's called a sneaky little helper. In trauma intervention, we call that a sneaky little helper. And often that's not an expression of empathy. That's a different kind of thing. It's something else. It's support, but it's a different kind of support. And I think it's important to make that differentiation in how we're understanding empathy versus our general academic mindset, where we do want to help and fix. And that's a little bit of a different role in my world, how I understand it.
Right.
That's really good, and that gets to, in that article about the disadvantage of empathy, is talking about the self-centeredness, right? Where if you're maybe trying to fix someone too much, or the helicopter parent, I'm so glad I'm not a parent, because I think I would be the worst. I think I would be so controlling, and there's a lot you obviously can't control with your kids. So to me, like parenting, even though I'm not a parent, I think is a good example, because it's like that, okay, I want to be supportive, I want to listen, I want to be present, but then what if your kid that you've defined, that person is doing something wrong in your mind, again, then does that mean you can't be empathetic in that situation? Do you just listen if they're, because again, it's very subjective from person to person, what's considered destructive or something that needs an intervention, but what about a situation like that?
So, that's, again, my whole world in early childhood. And so we work a lot with just noticing, like we'll teach parents to just notice what you're observing, and you just state back what it is. You look really upset right now. You really wanted that, toy, and I watched you hit your brother. And our job as parents or as teachers is to keep your body safe. And but and they're still stuck. They're stuck at that anger part. So you just keep attaching the feeling to it, and you're noticing. You're not trying to correct it. Obviously, if it gets to the safety part of it, you have to step in. But that's basically what we're teaching all of our parents, and again with our staff of Child Development Center, is we're just noticing without judgment is the key. And it's hard. It's like an art.
Well, I went to a wonderful workshop on positive behavior intervention support, PBIS. And it's great. Parenting, it's great in teaching, and I think it's like applicable to both children and adults. And there's when you're doing something to someone or telling someone to do something and being more directorial. And really the only situations where I see that really applying are direct safety issues, where you must protect them in the time. And that's true in trauma intervention as well. When I show up on an accident scene, for example, get called out by an ambulance and there's somebody having a grief reaction because they just watched something crazy happen to their spouse or car or something like that. You protect them by, the only time you don't let them do whatever naturally they feel that they need to do at that moment is they're trying to, run into the street. You're like, okay, I'm going to physically kind of get in your way here, but otherwise you don't tell them what to do. You just listen and be there with them. And if you don't know what to say, you don't say anything. That's ideally the best solution. And really the only okay thing is sometimes I'm sorry, but not I understand, none of that. You just kind of like, I'm sorry, or I noticed that something. But there's like a dance that you do with people, and most of the time it's those safety issues, which is really a good 5% of things, maybe, where you're actually giving the advice and telling them exactly, what you feel is the best answer, or what to do with feedback, or whatever.
Yeah, I'm sure, Damion, in wilderness, safety comes up like all the time, so you probably have to make those interventions.
Oh yeah, of course. But usually you set those expectations and boundaries, and you try to minimize. And I agree with everyone, is the non-judgment aspect of leadership is the most important thing.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, to be in that non-judgmental. But yeah, obviously if safety's involved, you have to step in.
Yeah.
Life and death situations, bad injury, of course.
What I notice with teaching of adults in comparison to children is that the children are almost, this goes to your parenting, that you said you wouldn't want to be a parent,
right.
That the children are almost always doing what they're supposed to do developmentally, and it's the adult reaction that we have to be willing to change, right? That control factor, to put ourselves in their shoes. And why does that suddenly, why does this bother you? It's okay that the child's doing this. So when we see all those little things in our classroom, it's about our own self-awareness, that we have to recognize our own inner selves before we can talk about what's going on in our classrooms.
Yeah. It's really good. Mary?
This reminds me of a reading that I did when I was in grad school for one of my pedagogy courses. It was on active listening, and basically the author's argument was something like, as teachers, we can stand to listen more. Like, we're not doing enough listening to our students. And it was all about how important it is to actively just listen, kind of like the point you brought up. It's kind of harder to do that in a lecture-based classroom, which is probably why I'm really happy that I don't teach. I teach English, and so my classrooms are discussion-based. It's a lot easier to incorporate that listening component in my classroom, but I think that goes hand in hand.
Yeah. So it seems like the theme is strategies for better listening, radical listening, whatever you want to call it, where you're truly trying to get a sense of the other person, and that's where I guess the understanding part of it is listening. Because I think the sharing, it's interesting that the article, the sort of the negative take on empathy, was talking about doctors working in ERs and saying, there's this issue of empathy. I don't think it's fatigue. It's called empathy burnout. So that's a challenge too, and I can't imagine working, as Elizabeth was getting at, if you're working in a therapeutic setting and you're constantly seeing trauma. I think about like the first responders, 9/11, right? Like for lack of maybe intervention there, or we gave psychological counseling. I know with a recent situation on campus involving one of our soccer players, this district, I was happy to hear provided counseling for the team. But that issue of empathy burnout is kind of interesting, right? Like where if you take in all this trauma, right, eventually it's like who helps you out kind of thing. And so that's a really interesting conversation too. And I don't know if we deal a lot with trauma per se, but it could happen in classrooms where you have certain students who have challenges, or they were recently released from incarceration and you're trying to help them, and maybe you don't have all the skills to help them, so you can listen. But then that next stage, whatever that is, in building that relationship, maybe there's a bit of a block there, because we can't all be experts in everything in terms of interfacing with other people. But did you feel like you could get burnt out doing too much of that with your clients, students, coworkers?
I think it's something definitely, to just keep in mind, and it kind of comes back to, the whole issue again that goes along with ISP can apply to, any other classroom setting, is the over familiarity. Mm-hmm. Am I getting over familiar with the student's situation? There's kind of a fine line between empathy and, where to actually draw the line, and, realize that, you need to refer them to someone else and not take on their problems, as your own.
Real quick example, I know Elizabeth next, but someone recently was mentioning to me, with more and more student workers on campus, maybe we could do a workshop, and the workshop could be the line between being a student and being a student worker, because maybe in terms of your dress or familiarity, how you address authority figures on campus. Yeah, and we don't have like our hierarchical organization, but it was an interesting comment because the person was suggesting to me that maybe some of our student workers just sometimes blur the lines. And part of what we're teaching students in classes in working at the college are soft skills and professional skills about, sometimes you have to switch roles, right? Your role isn't student right now, it's student worker, and that's a little bit different in terms of how you interface with all of us professionally and also the campus. So there are some lines there that get blurred on campus sometimes, I think. Or even more so in the past, I would say, where we had maybe administration and faculty where, if they were socializing a lot and they were overly familiar, and that translated to, are they going to be fair to all faculty or just the faculty that they socialize with, right? So there's always that line there that maybe, as an organization, would be healthy to analyze. And I'm not saying those lines shouldn't be blurred, because that does what many of you are saying, which is increase the relationship and the sense of commitment you have with each other. But then, just in some context, if it seems to me, if you're a student worker, maybe you do have to have a certain way that you dress and address people, and that you can't be too familiar and chummy, because it might not come off the right way to the public. I don't know if that seems too stodgy, but someone brought this up. Elizabeth, you have 10 minutes.
I think it's two separate issues.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is that Brené Brown, which I really, really like her, social work researcher, PhD, best-selling author, TED Talks, whatever. She interviews so many people, and she calls certain people like Gandhi or these leaders who end up, doing a lot of amazing community things generally. She calls them the wholehearted. And then she interviewed them, and she figured out, okay, what allows these people to have this tremendous ability to handle themselves in a way that they're able to express empathy a lot, really, offer forgiveness and help people sustainably. And it was boundaries. The number one key thing that she found that they had is actually that they established better boundaries than anybody else. So people who identified as, they felt that they were satisfied with life and they had really good relationships and stuff, they had good boundaries. And I think that's kind of where a lot of us can perceive better training and socialization and teaching, etc. And how do we establish these for ourselves? And I noticed, like, when I've done trauma intervention, it's a volunteer thing, but I've done it, and then I haven't realized how much I was affected by some of the situations that I was in until I'm like, oh, shoot. this really is influencing me. And so one has to be very self-aware and then capable of expressing themselves in a way that they can provide the boundaries to be able to then be able to sustainably serve the student or whomever they're kind of helping or counseling or listening to or being, in the whole with dealing with some of their issues. And I think that I went to an event that they said actually balanced life, which does, I don't know, a bunch of psychology stuff around here. They're hosting a meeting now that is free, a therapy group over a lunch period, I guess. And I would love to get the info from you guys. Yeah. And they are talking just about this, empathy fatigue, and how do you address it. She's giving, like the lady who teaches it is giving workshops on some skills, and one of them is boundaries, or how do you address it.
That's great.
Yeah, that is.
And setting those boundaries will differ with the context, obviously, depending on what you're dealing with. Because if you're dealing with trauma or addiction or issues where there's like an intervention involved, that's different than, in a classroom setting, if it's something related to, during your work-in on time or something like that, that's not, it could potentially be, but it's not like a life-threatening situation if someone just needs to get more on track. So yeah, setting the boundaries is really, really key. Does anyone ever think that we, as an institution, that we sometimes are maybe too familiar to, because I worry about that a little bit. Someone was saying with the Promise classes that sending the message that, and it's true, most of it's free books and free tuition and cost pass and doing all this wraparound servicing, then the question becomes like, is the person going to invest or not in terms of if everything's free and provided to them? And it seems like, well, this program, we got your back kind of thing. And I think that's an important message. But then the individual, right, has to play a role. And that's why, to go back to Damien's original point, I said, if it's someone who is struggling with addiction and they need to make a change, something has to happen, right, whatever that is, in the person eventually, if they're going to, become less addicted or whatever. So I sometimes wonder with students coming today, are we too familiar with them? Are we too friendly? Are we maybe emphasizing the relationship up front, saying like, hey, we got your back and we're here to help you, whereas we've jumped over like what you're talking about, maybe 10 steps, because to get to that sense of familiarity and even active listening, you kind of need to know someone. Like if you go to a therapist, that person, the first, second, third meeting likely will just be trying to get a sense, not a profile, but a sense of who you are, and they're not going to immediately jump in, maybe with some traumatic issues that they've identified through your profile or whatever that you filled out. But I just wonder sometimes about that familiarity. If we do too much up front, if we're over familiar, where we need to let that relationship sort of develop itself over time a little more. Or no?
Well, and I wonder about the entitlement factor, right? Is that not being empathetic to make that judgment that this student has all these offerings, and yet suddenly they don't seem to be giving back in terms of fulfilling that promise on being a good student, or those are all judgments, right?
Yeah.
What are the parameters for the promise student? Do they have to have some GPA?
Yeah, minimum 2.0 GPA, attend one event per quarter, meet with Christy, the counselor, twice a month, attend the Promise class within the first 2 quarters. It's like etched in my brain. There are a lot of requirements, and if you go down with Adam and Julie, they have a spreadsheet. It's crazy, all the different requirements. And the theory is that, because I call it the touch points, like in the world of branding. So the idea of, if you're a successful brand, the more touch points that with Apple or with BMW, whatever brand is out there, the more sense of connection or relationship you'll feel with that brand. So I think what we're trying to do with Promise is to say there are more touch points, physical, literal, or virtual. Where we're saying you're going to check in with your navigator, they're going to text message you, they're going to do all this stuff. So for me, the scary part would be is if it didn't work, right? Now, of course, someone said, well, if you get kicked out of the program, as long as you don't track those 2 cohorts, the people who got kicked out, everyone who is in the program and stays on track, you should have 100% success, because the whole point is if you get kicked out of Promise, you're no longer part of the program. But to me, that is going to be an interesting experiment for us to see these increased touch points, increased relationships, including virtual relationships. We're doing a lot with active texting. As we speak, we're just launching something in my classes through the Chancellor's Office, which is a financial literacy project. And the first part is Naomi giving a lecture with the stuff that the Chancellor's Office has curated for us. And then the second part will be the virtual touch points where students are contacted by ambassadors or others, and we say, hey, are you keeping on track in terms of your financial literacy and making a plan for your future and putting aside some money like we told you to. So it's kind of interesting to think about Promise as a case study for some of this, because if it's successful, we probably roll some of this out like Wynn, and I don't think Mary's classes, but we're doing embedded tutors.
Yeah.
Embedded tutors are part of this idea of more wraparound services, more relationships, and the idea of embedded tutors is the relationships established are more with former students, maybe?
Yeah, and that's
Because they
been
know the
huge for
material.
me.
So it's working.
It's
Okay.
fantastic.
Excellent.
It's been fantastic for math because, a lot of students who, might feel a little shyer about coming to me, they come to the tutor readily. And I'm actually there a lot of times when the tutor is as well. And so it's kind of like there is a team. It gives us an impression that there's a team of people to help rather than just one person.
Mary, do you have?
Oh, I am an embedded tutor.
Oh, you are?
For,
Okay, I thought you had it.
for Julie's
Wow.
101 class.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's working out really well. Like Wynn said, you really are kind of like a team with the students, and you can kind of be a go-between between the students and the instructor, because there are some students who are shy, or they'll confide in me some things or ask certain things about the assignment to me that they don't ask to Julie, and then I go and ask her, and I go and tell her what the students are saying. Yeah.
So to relay that a little better, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's building a better bridge between teachers and students. I think it's already a really great program.
That's great.
It's helped building a community. It's like I notice there are more students at office hours, who regularly attend, and they kind of get to know each other a little bit too. And that's kind of huge.
Yeah. And office hours, I was just recording some material for our CDC OEI grant, which is a $500,000 grant we launched this year that is focusing on improving the quality of DE instruction in a lot of our CTE areas, wilderness, culinary arts, hospitality, and so forth. And one of the things with that I was saying is that the office hours in general are generally, I at least find, underused.
Yeah.
That sometimes can come. So if we could emphasize office hours more, because going back to time and relationship building, that's really where the one-on-one instruction happens. And Damion mentioned earlier that if some students take maybe a little too much time, you might have to say to that person, I can't spend as much time as you want, but maybe you come to office hours if they're available. But office hours really are that time where you can spend, it's not just individualized, but it's getting back to what you started off saying today, is that relationships and time and developing rapport between the student and the instructor. So I feel like office hours, that'll happen more, and it sounds like through embedded tutoring, whereas if you're just lecturing to a class, it can be kind of a cold experience.
Definitely.
It feels hierarchical, right? It's that traditional classroom, and it maybe doesn't really sense. Because there's anxiety, not just about math, but there's anxiety about authority figures.
Yeah.
Elizabeth knows all your experience, with classrooms and pedagogy, right? Like where just you standing in front of the classroom, if that's how you lecture, right, potentially that creates anxiety just about this person's an authority figure, and I can't relate to this person because look who they are, and I'm just a student sitting at a desk. So it sounds like if we build more community with these models of embedded tutoring and others, that could be really positive for us.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a great bridge.
Yeah.
I guess I'm having this ethical challenge with dual enrollment, where, you were mentioning, I'm going to backtrack our conversation, you were talking about familiarity, but then you were talking about things that are actually to do with rigor and expectations. Mm-hmm. And I want to make the distinction. So giving people books, giving people forms and, handing it to them so that they can get them signed, highlighting the form to make it easier for them. This is rigor and expectations. Mm-hmm. Whereas familiarity, that's the relationship building and a lot of these contacts and the touch points and et cetera that you're talking about. And what I'm having trouble with dual enrollment is I think in order for them to be successful in college, have realistic expectations, and to be retained eventually and graduate, is how much do we baby them?
Yes.
And by that, I'm talking only about rigor and expectations in academia. I'm not talking about the relationships. I say, yeah, amp that up. Let's have as many relationships as possible. Let's get them contacted and engaged in the community, because we know that engagement is the number one college success factor. Actually, do you have a community? Are you engaged in student life? Are you doing things? Are you doing work study? Are you taking tutoring? Whatever, all of that, very successful. I want as much of that as possible. What I don't want is for them to see that college is going to include a lot of this hand-holding that I don't think is realistic, especially once they get here, and then maybe even when they transfer somewhere else. And the workload won't be like that either. And so I feel like there's a balance, and this is back to the boundaries piece, but it's boundaries kind of between these two worlds of rigor and expectations and familiarity and engagement. That we want to encourage one thing, but then we also want to maintain high rigor and expectations. So an empathetic thing to do might be to stick to your deadline. When that student comes to you and says, I need an extension, you assess it, and you say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Why? Because I'm teaching you a lesson about rigor and expectations. And in college, we won't change deadlines because, you have whatever happen. It's a case-by-case kind of thing. So I don't want to set the expectation that teachers are going to be like a lot of high school teachers have become. And that's that's controversial stuff to say, but it's true. This belief that you can just kind of skate by till the end of, the semester and then pull off a passing grade. They learned that in high school. And you're probably seeing it, I would take, as academics here teaching these students. A lot of them, sometimes they think that that's possible. And it's not. You have to pace yourself in college. Time management,
Yeah, the continuum between nurturing effectively and coddling. And it's kind of what sparked maybe my thoughts about empathy. It's like with the Promise program, how much is going too far, because we want students to be responsible and proactive, and like you said, develop the skills for the work world or graduate school or undergrad studies. And so it's such a tricky line, right, to define that. Just enough, for me it's just enough nurturing, but I never really know what that line is. I just think the line varies from student to student, right? So, well, maybe last minute or two just to close, since we're ending at 12:45. It's a good conversation. Maybe we can pick it up at the next talk for sure. Just closing thoughts, or maybe where we might be headed for a future conversation. Would you take this topic in a different direction? Maybe yours could be just, I really like this. Like if we said, okay, there's this line between being empathetic and being nurturing, and then coddling, not preparing them. How do we define that as an institution? Would that be a good future conversation?
Because I really
Okay.
Yeah, how do we get to that boundary part?
Yeah.
And I want them to come to you prepared.
Yeah.
I want these students to understand what they're getting into. And, expectations is a big part of that predictability and comfort, which we establish for them, which will cause them not to be in trauma reaction when they hit this and just are shocked, at how different it is as a transition. I don't want that to occur. So, if we could come up with a way, I don't know, I love that concept.
Okay, so
I don't think giving them free tuition and free textbooks is coddling.
No.
I was on the Bob waiver when I attended here, and I certainly didn't take my education for granted because it was free. So, so where do we draw the line? What is coddling? I honestly don't know what it is. It'd be interesting to
maybe. So our next
perspectives on that.
Next conversation. So we're going to draw to a close. Thank you for coming physically. Thank you virtually for coming as well. We hope you enjoyed it. Be on the lookout for the next announcement. Our next one, it sounds like, examining the continuum between nurturing and coddling. I don't know. Or we can call it something more academic. So, okay, thank you all.